In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to make a stone point that can actually screw into a standard carbon fiber or aluminum arrow. First, you need to get machined screws that match the diameter and thread pitch of the screws on your broadheads. Be sure the thread pitch matches by interlocking the threads of the screws together like this. If they fit like these, then you know they'll work. Drill a small hole into the end of a short seasoned hardwood chute. You can use oak, dogwood, privet, elm, Osage orange, or any comparable hardwood. Yeah, it's got a little bit of a wobble to it, but it's not bad. Very carefully drill into the chute so that the hole is in alignment with the piece of wood. Try to make it as straight as possible. Now the next step is to screw this threaded screw down into the foreshaft. And the one thing you want to be real careful about is it's not too tight. If this gets too tight in here, you can split that wood, which you don't want to do. So I'll take a screwdriver and I'll just very carefully screw that in. As long as it goes fairly easily in there. You want it to be snug, but you don't want it to start getting real tight. Checking the alignment there too. Looks pretty good. Once it's straight, coat the end of the screw in super glue and screw it back into the hardwood. Use a screwdriver to screw that. Now while we're waiting for that super glue to dry, there's another thing I want to make note of. Now this is actually just a thin little strip of printer paper, just regular paper. What I'm going to do is coat this in the super glue, and I'm going to wrap it around the threads here, and this is going to form that collar that you see on the modern broadheads, the screw-in part of it. And this will, I need to keep adding super glue to this, but this will act almost as a spacer to help center this, so that when it's mounted in the arrow, it stays straight. It's not wobbling inside the arrow. Once the paper collar that's soaked in super glue has dried, cut the screw head off with a Dremel tool and cutoff wheel. Then carefully taper the cut end of the screw to remove any damaged threads by spinning the end of the cut screw held at an angle against the cutoff wheel. Let's see how it fits and how it lines up on our arrow. Pretty good. It's got a little bit of a wobble to it. Yeah, a little more than I'd hoped. Not bad though. We can correct some of that misalignment now. If you remember, I had this screw that had the depth gauge, the little tape marker on it. So what I want to do is I want to mark exactly how deep that screw goes in there. It's about right there. And I want to mark that. So that will tell me that I don't want to saw. When I shorten this piece up, I want to leave enough wood there that we have enough meat and reinforcement so that stone point will not be right up against where that screw is. So what I'm going to end up doing is probably cutting this foreshaft a little bit shorter. I don't know, maybe to about, I might cut 3/4 of an inch off of there, and that'll give us plenty of space in between where the screw ends and where the stone point will mount in. Actually, I'll give it a little bit more. Let's say I only cut about 1/2 inch off of there. This is one reason why when you make these, you want to make this foreshaft diameter larger than your actual arrow itself. You can make corrections. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to see where the top part of that is, and then I'm going to start carving away the high part, essentially. All right, now let's check that again. Oh yeah. Yeah, see, that's really in line now. No wobble whatsoever. Very, very slight, but like I said, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to weigh the foreshaft itself first. See that we are at 74 grains. Here's a 59 grain stone point. It's 131 grains. That's pretty close. Let's see what else we got here. 74. Let's see what that one weighs in at. 116. I don't know what that point weighs. Let's see this one. 115. 114 actually, but see, this one is 65, so it's going to be heavier. It's 137. So you could do any combination of points. Let's see what that one weighs. 116. So I'd say that one with a 60 grain stone points right at 133 grains. That's pretty darn close to 125. It's almost 10 grains more, but you could mount that in there and then just chip a little bit off the edges to reduce the weight. A notch is then sawed into the front of the hardwood foreshaft with a hacksaw blade. Then the notch is widened with a knife to fit the stone point. Finally got it set. That looks pretty good. I don't really see it wobbling at all when I spin it. Now, last thing we need to do is taper these corners here, the leading edges of that foreshaft, so that it tapers down into a nice smooth transition from the foreshaft to the stone point. Then we'll mix up a 2-part epoxy, put it in there and dab it in, set the point in there and let it harden and dry. And then we'll go ahead and put the finishing touches, wrap this on, and it'll be done. Then the front of the foreshaft is tapered with a sharp knife so there's no harsh leading edges. Then to add some artistic flair, the foreshaft is painted black and yellow. The point is then glued in with epoxy, and the epoxy is left to harden. Once the epoxy is cured, it's trimmed with a razor knife to ensure a smooth taper. Looks much better now. Those blobs of epoxy have been trimmed away, and the transition there between the point and the shaft itself are very smooth. So there's nothing to hang up and impede penetration. Now the last thing we need to do is just wrap this with sinew. What I'm going to use is actually artificial sinew here. Of course, you can use real sinew if you want. But I'll start the wrapping underneath the arrowhead like that. Wrap that base. Then bring the wrap up through the notch and then back down. Then underneath it half a wrap, and then through the other notch, and then back down, and half a wrap, back through the original notch, and just keep doing that till you get good coverage. Now I got a couple wraps on there, then I'm going to wrap underneath, down the shaft to reinforce it, to prevent it from splitting. And each successive wrap will butt right up against the previous wrap. The tail end of the wrapping is then pulled up underneath the last few wraps with a short loop of binding, and the extra is cut off. So I just touched up the edge on this point with a really narrow, thin, very fine pressure flaker and put in these little micro serrations on this point, and man, this thing is sharp. You can just feel it. I rub it on my upper lip. It feels sticky. It's so sharp. All those little points of those serrations, you can tell they just want to cut. And man, that thing would do devastating damage to a big game animal. And it is really cool. I just like the added look of the black and yellow paint on there, and then the wrapping, and just how it fits right on the end of this carbon fiber arrow, just screws right in. It's cool. This thing weighs right at 130 grains, so it's 5 grains over the traditional 125 grain point, but it would fly beautifully off of just about any bow or arrow. So the finished point fits beautifully into a modern arrow, and they've proved deadly on big game.